Chapter 12, Key Issue 4, talks about why services cluster in settlements. And so we'll look at the difference between clustered and dispersed rural settlements, which shouldn't be too difficult because we've looked at clustered and rural, or clustered and dispersed, populations, and clustered and dispersed resources. So this should just, be a review of that. We'll look at the types of services found in early settlements, and we'll look at important prehistoric, ancient, medieval urban settlements. And we'll look at the two different dimensions of urbanization. So rural settlements tend to take one of two forms, either a clustered settlement, that's going to be usually an agricultural-based community in which a number of families live in close proximity to each other, and they're going to have fields surrounding the collection of houses and farm buildings. It's going to include things like homes, barns, tool sheds, consumer services, and religious structures, schools, and shops. A dispersed rural settlement, typical of the North American rural settlement, is characterized by farmers living on individual farms isolated from their neighbors. So here's an example of a clustered settlement, a clustered rural settlement, and except for the main road going through it, we can see how some of our early settlements in New England would have followed this pattern. And then here is your dispersed. So think Midwest and up further west, where you have single farms and they live really far away from each other. So if you think clustered rural settlement, think small towns. You picture a rural small town area, that would be clustered. And if you thought of giant farms spreading across Idaho, people, they live here and they have to drive into town, and that would be dispersed. In early settlements, we had, what kind of consumer services did we have? We had to have places to bury the dead. And we had religious leaders that were stationed at burial sites to perform the service of saying prayer for the deceased. These were likely to encourage the building of more permanent structures for ceremonies and dwellings. And we also had manufacturing centers, even though they wouldn't be giant factories like we had today. You might have a pottery making center or a blacksmith making tools, leather workers, tanners. A lot of times to cure leather, they would use urine, so tanners would be kind of outside of the city, and most people wouldn't want to do that at home. Early public services would have included people who built walls and soldiers and defenders, so they were tasked with offering protection to people in the settlement. But also, they had to regulate when rules were broken, so they also had some governance. And then they sometimes would have people who would go from settlement to settlement to act as a judicial service. Some of the early business services that would happen would be regulating the terms of transactions, setting fair prices, keeping records, and creating a currency system. So often the settlement would serve as neutral ground, so groups could come together to safely trade goods and services and to negotiate fair prices. It would be less threatening than having people show up at your settlement or your home to try to negotiate for your materials. And when we started to build larger settlements, since we lived in permanent areas and we started to build larger ones, we had some of our earliest urban settlements. And so some of the earliest urban settlements were in the Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia or the Middle East, and then North Africa. So among the oldest is Ur in Mesopotamia, which is present-day Iraq. So here's what's called a ziggurat, or a temple. The ziggurat has steps going up and then a small ceremonial top like this. So ziggurats are formed like this. And they probably were the inspiration and later gave rise to pyramids. Similar designs to the ziggurat are found, across different cultures when they became larger. And so, Aztec temples and Mayan temples look very similar to the ziggurat. Not necessarily because they ever saw them, but because it's a simple and elegant way to design a large ceremonial center. So settlements were first established in the eastern Mediterranean about 2500 BC. So you have Knossos in the island of Crete, Troy in modern-day Turkey, and Mycenae in Greece. These urban settlements were primarily trading centers, and so they were organized into city-states. So each of these settlements were self-governing communities that included the settlement and the nearby countryside. Athens was the largest city-state in Greece, and Rome was believed to have a population between 250,000 people up to 1 million people at its height. And so here you see the rise of different urban centers throughout the Middle East or Southwest Asia. This settlement here is fascinating, HuG. So if you have time to look it up, it's really, really cool. Then in the Middle Ages or medieval times, we had the medieval urban settlements. And so these were networks of small market towns that would serve the needs of particular lords. And so think about what you maybe remember about feudal Europe. Each lord had his own little center. The largest medieval European settlements would have served as power centers for lords, church leaders, and major market centers. And usually, so like the king, who is like the highest lord of all the other nobles, would have a large urban settlement. Nobles that had more power would have larger urban settlements. And, more of the minor nobles, they would have really small, maybe more agricultural centers. Usually the tallest, most elaborate structures were their churches, and most of the early urban centers were surrounded by walls. There is a great place in France to go visit if you want to see what a medieval urban settlement would have looked like. They have it recreated, but it's been preserved and yet recreated, so it's like a Disney version of an urban city, and it's really, really cool. How did urban settlements start to rapidly urbanize? Urbanization has two dimensions. So when the population of a settlement grows, you first have an increase in the number of people that live in that settlement. So developing countries right now have 8 of the 10 most populous cities, which makes sense, right? Because they have a rapid growth in their population. They have more people. Developing countries tend to have larger populations than our developed countries right now. So you're going to have a rapid growth of the people who are moving in. And you're going to have an increase in the percentage of people who live in urban settlements. Not just the number of people who live in urban settlements, but your percentage. So if you look at percentage of people living in urban settlements has increased from 3% in 1800 to 6% in 1850 to 14% in 1900, 30% in 1950, up to 47% in 2000. This is globally. In developed countries, about 3/4 of the world's population lives in urban centers, and in developing countries, about 2/5 of the population is urbanized. So if you look at this map here, you can see that the percent urban and really across almost all of North America is 75% or above. It's down here in the Central American area that you get down to 50 to 74 or below 50. Places like South Sudan have no data. Again, it's a new country. So by 2014, when this slide was published, it wouldn't have collected much data on it yet, since it was established as a country in 2010. And Western Sahara, which is a contested territory, doesn't have any data collected on it. You can see that India here still has below 50% urban areas. China, less than 50% of its population lives in urban areas. And so for China, really, it's that larger rural population that keeps it qualified as a developing country. And here you can see your urban settlements with at least 2 million people. So the darkest dots on here are places where people have 10 million people or above. So New York, LA, Mexico City, Paris, Tokyo. And then the reddish dots are where 5 to 9.9 million people. So Miami, London, and then you've got your 3 to 4.9 million people, the orange dots, and then your smaller megacities. These dark dots here are known as megacities because they have over 10 million people, and we'll learn about megacities in a little bit. So in summary of this chapter, most jobs are in the service sector, especially in developed countries. Having the majority of your jobs being in primary or secondary economic sectors is a hallmark of being a developing country. Consumer services follow a regular pattern based on the size of settlements. So smaller settlements have less consumer services and ones that fulfill, more basic daily needs. Business services are disproportionately clustered in a handful of urban settlements. And so we do have, remember that map of the U.S. with its economic base, there were areas of our country that didn't have any business services that were clustered in that area. And services cluster in both rural and urban settlements as a function of market areas. So how big is the area you're selling your materials? How far can people come to get your service, and how many people do you need to keep your service alive, or your threshold. And market areas, ranges, and thresholds are all integral to the central place theory.